All right, so moving right along here, we're going to move on to feminism. And in particular, we're going to be talking about relational cultural therapy, which is a particular form of feminist therapy. So you may have noticed in your textbook that there are a ton of variations on feminist therapies and theories. For the sake of time and coherence, I'm really going to focus on one that I feel is one of the most structured systems of counseling in this tradition, and that is the relational cultural therapy. You read a case study about that particular therapy, or you will at some point, maybe after you watch this lecture, which really describes a client from the perspective of this theory. And so I just wanted to give you a little bit of background so that when you do approach that article, it'll start to make a bit more sense. So again, as your text said, often feminism and feminist thought is used as a conceptual framework or a theoretical paradigm alongside another theory of counseling. However, I do think RCT, Rational Cultural Therapy, is a really unique contribution to our field and might well be a modality that you might want to use someday. And it's certainly one that I think can kind of stand on its own. So I'd like to go ahead and emphasize that today in our video lecture. So the two theorists that are responsible for relational cultural therapy are Jean Baker Miller and Judith Jordan. And they were counselors or psychotherapists who were working up at Smith College. And they were very interested in kind of putting some structure into a feminist theory, you know, that they had a nice feminist theory training, and that ultimately they were really interested in kind of creating something that could kind of rival the other theories that we've discussed. And what they created together was relational cultural therapy. So, moving ahead. So, relational cultural therapy really came in response to the traditional beliefs held by the psychological community that separation and individuation are ultimately the goals of human development. So you start to think about, you know, Erikson, you think about Freud, you think about all of these developmental models where like the fully healthy adult is one who is independent and can kind of support themselves. Well, this traditional view, according to this theory, views pathologies or pathologizes what many now understand to be kind of the normal developmental needs of women, and that they would label women's need for connection as dependency, conceptualizing as a tendency to become enmeshed in others. And rational cultural therapy holds that all people, and particularly women, develop in relationship with others, and that relationship is a key force in development. So you can again reflect back on Fritz Perls, you know, in his statement, you do your thing, I do my thing, and if we can connect and meet, then that's beautiful, and if we can't, it can't be helped. So this is really as opposite as you can get about this one. This theory really defines health and wellness as being in connection and being in relationships to others. And the reason that we sometimes struggle with that, the reason people find themselves with symptoms or find themselves in counseling, is that gender roles, power dynamics, and social political problems, really create problems, are really responsible for many of the problems that we face. And that it isn't necessarily the failure of the person to not connect with other people, that there are these structural things in our society that really thwart their ability to have good, meaningful relationships, to experience this, the feminists would say, the 5 good things, which are often characterized in psychology and counseling as things like enmeshment, dependency, and, to argue against that, rational cultural therapy really suggests that psychological problems are not the result of a failure to individuate, but instead are the result of disconnection. So how this theory helps clients heal, change, and grow. Well, the biggest kind of idea here is that the conditions that are necessary for optimal development are not necessarily met in all of the relationships we have in our life. And there are some ways that relationships and lives of people, particularly women, can impede or stifle growth. And the kind of ideal that we want really are some growth fostering relationships. So, if you have good relationships, these are relationships that foster your own growth and your own connection to other people. The relational cultural therapists really identify 5 core conditions that describe ideal relationships. And they allow people to have an experience of zest or vitality, to have them feel empowered to take action, to increase their knowledge of the self and others, to develop a sense of worth, and have the desire to seek out more relationships. And so in the process, the relational cultural model encourages clients to start to work to regain, by examining the kind of cultural structures that keep them down, that oppress them. Eventually, they're able to start to identify ways in their lives where they can reclaim their power, their authority, and their direction. And one of the ways that this happens is in the therapy relationship with the therapist. And that is achieved by allowing clients to experience a sense of shared power in that sort of therapeutic relationship. And that therapeutic relationship ultimately serves as a template for what healthy relationships with other people need to look like. These intimate relationships in therapy allow the client to really experience those 5 kind of ideal core relational conditions. So just to sum that all up again, you start by kind of looking at the way culture and gender roles and stereotyping have thwarted people's sense of power. You help clients identify those, and you help clients work to change them. And you also kind of give them this new experience through the therapeutic relationship of a way of relating to others that is not subordinate, that it's not subservient, where they're able to share and exchange power. And ultimately, this is more growth supporting and fulfilling than the other types of relationships. So some key assumptions in this theory. These assumptions are fairly standard to a lot of feminist thought and to feminist therapy. The first assumption is that the person is political. And when we say that, this is the idea that empowerment and social action are also the goals of therapy. So women really need to be aware of gender role stereotyping, discrimination, and sexism, and then need to work to change this type of treatment in their society. So in addition to working with this individual, you're also working with the broader cultural landscape. The next is that, psychotherapy should be subversive. Therapy is for change, change in the individual, change in the society. It is not about helping people just adjust to existing systems, which are probably fairly oppressive. And then lastly, when an individual is led to believe that what she desires most in some way, what she kind of wants in the world is either healthy or unhealthy, she'll do what she can to suppress those desires and label them, as many in the mainstream psychological community do, as evidence that she's overly dependent or needy. So this in turn may lead the individual to really question her own reality as she experiences it. Her desire for connection with others is labeled as dependency. She internalizes this and starts to believe that about herself. And ultimately, she starts to feel like she has to deny that and deny what she knows to be a fundamental truth about who she is. And when she's in that place, she can feel torn between being true to herself and being what she is led to believe is mentally healthy. And that, in turn, that starts to snowball and really lead someone to further question the accuracy of her perception of reality. And then that in turn causes her to be even more disconnected from her sense of who she is in the world. Some complicated ideas here. I'll acknowledge that. But very cool and very important. So, RCT argues that how you feel about yourself, sense of self-worth, is often based on to what extent you are conforming to some mythical norm based on your gender. And they would argue that this applies both to women and to men. And some of the mythical norms people face around gender are the idea that women are sex objects, women are nurturers, men are protectors, men are breadwinners, men display no weakness. So if you are not a sex object as a woman, if you are not conforming to some sort of mythical norm, then you have very little value. If you, as a woman, are not a mother, then you have very little value. If you are a man who is a stay-at-home dad, have very little value. And that the relational cultural therapy really argues that the ways in which we don't measure up to these mythical norms leads us to have low sense of self-worth. So I mentioned earlier that there's an idea of mutuality in the therapeutic relationship, and that is very important to the relational cultural process. RCT therapists will often return to these issues of informed consent to really remind the client that they're not subordinate to the therapist. It's ultimately a non-hierarchical relationship in which the client's really invited to be an equal. And this is maybe, a dialogue of how things might go on between the counselor and the client. So the counselor might say, "It's important for you to know that I won't try to change your beliefs. I will respect our differences. As we explore your distress you are feeling in your life, we may explore cultural and social forces outside yourself that are increasing distress. We may also talk about how you've come to believe unhelpful messages given to you by our culture." And the overall goal of therapy is really to empower you as a person. And anytime you feel I'm missing the point, pushing my agenda, giving too much direction, will you tell me? So, part of this is about explaining and demystifying the counseling process. Like, this is what we're going to do. This is how it's going to work. This is why I'm doing it. And I invite you as the person I'm working with to let me know how you're experiencing this. If I'm pushing too much, if I'm not saying the right things, if I'm not understanding you, you invite the client to really tell you that. And related to this, RCT counselors are really careful to let the client do the leading. The RCT counselor won't really push or probe unless the client wants to go in a certain direction. Not only is this a way of allowing the client to experience a different type of mature relationship, one that's marked by mutuality, it also really recognizes that the way a client comes into counseling relating to another person has been in response. It has been a survival strategy, if you will, and that the idea of kind of giving up some of these ways of relating might be very threatening. So relational cultural therapy tends to be very slow going. There's not a whole lot of pushing the clients to make changes. Another ritual around here within relational cultural therapy is the idea of social action. So again, empowerment and social action are important goals of this model of therapy. And part of this is really helping clients become aware of how stereotypes, sexism, discrimination, how that impacts their life, about how that has impacted their development, about how maybe it's thwarting their achievement of the things that they want in the world. And then they work with their clients towards changing this, not only for this individual in the way she regards herself or his self, but also the way that person regards other people and maybe some of the structures of power and systems that are in the broader world of your client. And sometimes that can be informal things like, encouraging your workplace to have more, to not have discriminatory practices when it comes to gender issues, but also can be more formal, like changing political or community equality, working for, I know the Equal Rights Amendment is coming back up, which works for equal pay for women. This would be something that a relational cultural therapist would probably encourage their clients to get involved and engage in a little bit of advocacy on that end. So another important, when we're moving on to the relationship here, and the relationship and the relational cultural therapy is very unique and very different than any other type of counseling that we've really discussed here. So you think about relationships and counseling as having two organizations. One is sort of a vertical hierarchy and the other is a horizontal hierarchy. So the vertical hierarchy recognizes that the counselor has more education, the counselor is the professional, the counselor is the one that's getting paid, the counselor knows what needs to happen. And the client is to some extent the more disempowered person in that situation. However, in RCT, the counselor and client are, considered to be more or less equals. Unlike in the vertical hierarchy where the counselor knows a lot more about the client than the client knows about the counselor, it's not unheard of for the client to know quite a bit about the counselor. In that power difference, part of the reason they do a lot of self-disclosure is really to reduce the power differential between the client and the counselor. And by creating this new mutuality relationship, the hope is that clients will learn how to connect more effectively with others. So this experience of being someone's equal is hopefully an experience that they can recreate in other relationships in their life, especially if they have been relationships that have been marked by unequal power, relationships with partners, relationships with spouses, relationships with friends, coworkers, sometimes supervisors, really trying to kind of create more equality and more egalitarian relationships in the client's life. And again, turning on to the relationship as being egalitarian. So when we say egalitarian, what we mean is that power is shared in this relationship. The client has power, the counselor has power, the client has power to talk about what they want to, when they want to, and the counselor ultimately respects that. And the sort of thinking behind this is that when power is shared and no one is subordinate, clients really feel free to speak their mind and be themselves. And of course, we know when clients feel free to speak their mind and to be themselves, that this can be profound for them. Very few clients who come to see us have ever had that experience again. So that's the idea of sort of shared power can ultimately be an empowering thing by letting the client be themselves. It gives clients the permission in the sense that they can be themselves and it will be okay. Next, the idea, RCT really believes that problems discussed in counseling should always be seen in the context of culture. And for that reason, cultural sensitivity is really important. And so the RCT therapist really wants to unpack to what extent the dominant culture may contribute or affect the problems the client is facing. Next, another aspect of the relationship and this egalitarian approach is that self-disclosure is frequently used to share experiences and impart wisdom. So giving the client more information about not only the therapeutic process, but also about the counselor themselves can be a way of helping the client to feel more like an equal, to feel more empowered. And it also is a way of being a role model for the client, of letting the client see someone who is in the world how they are. And they don't feel sort of torn between the real self that they want to be, the true self, and the self that they feel like they have to be in the world. Again, in RCT often discuss issues around female sexuality. The reason behind this is, I think, pretty self-explanatory. Female sexuality is a pretty taboo subject and is often linked to some of the problems clients face when they come to counseling. And I think that, like I said, this is a long-term modality. This is a very relationship-focused approach. So I think there is space for this and room for this, and clients tend to feel very comfortable disclosing things about their sexuality to their therapists as a result. So, some expectancy things. Why might this be a good modality for you to consider? Well, first of all, the empowerment aspect of the goals of counseling, of RCT, social action empowerment, really fits well with the professional identity of counseling. We assume a wellness model, and we have the belief that people are doing their best within their respective context. So I think that's another real reason that RCT could be an excellent fit for counselors. Another reason to consider it is that clients really appreciate the shared power and counselors' self-disclosure. Clients really like it when counselors are genuine and they can be known as they are. I think in general, clients really don't care for the blank screen approach. And lastly, a reason, if you're someone who has an interest in working with multicultural counseling with oppressed groups, they are likely to value the focus that this modality has on social and political environment, and to really recognize some of the systemic issues that contribute to the problems that they're experiencing. And for that reason, I think it's a really good approach when you're working from a multicultural context, because it has a lot of value for a very diverse client base. So some reasons you might not want to consider RCT. Well, the first is that some clients will want a bit more direction than the egalitarian relationship. It could potentially be frustrating to see a professional who has all of these degrees that you're paying, but also who treats you as an equal. It's like you go to the doctor's office and it's like, you could do X, you could do Y, you could do Z. It's like, dude, I didn't go to medical school. You did. Tell me what to do. I guess I don't like egalitarian. I do like egalitarian doctors, but sometimes I don't like egalitarian doctors. Some clients also will resist looking at micro-level social influences. So they may say things like, I just want help with my problems. The person is political. It may not be for everyone, and it might be fairly frustrating for some clients. And then lastly, counselors must really resist the temptation to change client beliefs, to really impose their values on it, which can be kind of hard, because I would say RCT has a pretty strong, coherent, well-articulated political perspective, and that that this is something of a paradox, that you want your client to get somewhere, but you don't want to tell your client where to go. So that can be a real challenge, and one of the reasons I think that this is a very hard way to work completely. So here's some further reading here on relational cultural therapy, and also some further reading if you're interested in narrative therapy, which is of course a great way of looking at stories and looking at how we have maybe created rigid ideas around who we are and our categories, and counselors can kind of help us restory and rewrite those categories and narratives. So again, just a brief discussion of theoretical integration, kind of weighing the strengths and weaknesses of all of the theories here. We're getting to the final conversation here of our video lectures. So this is really a chart of some of the strengths and weaknesses of the counseling theories that we have discussed. So again, returning to psychodynamic theory. So psychodynamic theory is really marked by the idea that people are largely determined by their childhood experiences and by some of their unconscious drives and desires. This theory in particular has a lot around the myth, and it also has a lot around the relationship. So the idea of the transference, the countertransference, it does well there. Moving on next to Adlerian therapy. So Adlerian therapy believes that humans are naturally social creatures, and that we are all seeking some way to fit into our social world, to have a role, to have a purpose, to do something, to overcome our sense of inadequacy. And this one has some information, if you can tell from the chart here, about the myth, some ritual things, and some information about how the relationship works. Next, the behaviorist. So very dense on the idea of mythology, the sort of notion that all behavior can be understood through the perspective of reinforcement and punishment, and that ultimately this is about learning. There's a lot that they say about ritual as well, or lots of behavior therapy techniques that are out there, but says very little about the relationship. Not really clear how a cognitive behavioral therapist is supposed to act and how that contributes to change. Next is cognitive behavioral therapy. Again, slightly less on the myth, a bit more on the ritual. You know, they have tons and tons of techniques that are really potentially very helpful, but again, doesn't say a whole lot about the relationship. You know, you can think about Aaron Beck and you can think about Albert Ellis, and their style of relating was very much tied to who they were as people in the world, and it can be hard, I think, to negotiate what that means for you as a new counselor. Next, existential therapy. Of course, this is really a set of concerns or set of focuses in counseling. So it has some fairly well articulated ideas of the myth that we're free and that we ultimately must choose our lives, but doesn't have a whole lot of ritual. Not a lot of existential techniques are out there, and has something to say that's, I think, meaningful about the relationship, the idea of the counselor as the fellow traveler. Moving on to the next theory, person-centered therapy. So again, the person-centered therapy is the idea that we're, raised under conditions of worth, and that over time we start to create a false sense of self, and we become a false self in the world, and that it is ultimately the healing power of the relationship, of accurate empathy, of attunement, of those kind of core conditions that brings about healing. Unfortunately, for everything that person-centered therapy says about relationship, it's a little bit thin on the ritual. So perhaps a drawback there. And the next, moving on to solution-focused therapy, again, little on myth, little on relationship, but quite a bit on ritual. Moving again onto sort of the theoretical spectrum, if you're trying to figure out how to compare these theories, trying to figure out where you fall, understand how they are in relationship to one another, I think this is a nice diagram that shows you on a spectrum from concrete, specific, short-term objectives, kind of more structured, with sort of solution-focused brief therapy and rational emotive therapy, behavior therapy, down to the more general, global, long-term objectives that tend to be less structured and more process-based. So systemic, psychodynamic, Jungian, relational cultural therapy. Again, these tend to be much more long-term. So you can kind of think about that, about how you plan on working with your clients, how long you plan on working with them, and seeing if the theoretical orientation that you're interested in matches up with that. I would also say, of course, there are brief versions of each of these. So maybe not hard and fast rules, but at least thinking about the mythology and the kind of ideal practice of this theoretical orientation. And then lastly, kind of looking here at the role of the counselor. So this diagram here, I think, does a nice job of outlining how the counselor in each of these therapies can take on a different role. And some, they're the expert, and some, they're the educator, and others, they're collaborators, and others, they're sort of a facilitator. And in most of these, they are more than one. So you can look at kind of cognitive therapies here, where the person is both the expert and the educator. Psychodynamic, of course, expert and the facilitator. Adlerian is the expert and the educator, of course, thinking about all those parenting trainings. So this is just a helpful slide as you're thinking about how to compare these different modalities in terms of the relationship and the role of the counselor. Figure out which one works best for you.